Hi, my name is Teresa and I'm coming to you from sunny Arizona. I've been making masks for the last several weeks and have used lots of the designs out there. I've come up with my own that I want to share with you. Now the big difference between my mask and others is that I use bias tape to encase the raw edges. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is the wire that we often put in masks to make it fit better around the nose. The problem with wire is it's awfully pointy and you don't want it poking somebody in the face. By using the bias tape, you can stitch it into the mask a little bit better and make sure that that wire doesn't move around. It also provides a couple of extra layers of fabric between the wire and the wearer in case some piece of wire goes a little rogue. Now, another reason that I like using bias tape is insertion of the elastic. I use a 7-inch piece of elastic, and most of the designs for masks out there have you put the mask right sides together and then turn it inside out. By using the bias tape, you can encase that directly inside of the bias tape and you don't have to turn it inside out. That saves a step. Now, in addition to the elastic and the wire, you're going to need fabric and bias tape. So the fabric that I use is 8.5 inches wide by 14 inches long. Now, a lot of people are making masks that are out of 6-inch pieces of fabric, doubled to 12. I actually like the little bit longer pieces of fabric in my mask, but if you want to make a shorter one, that's obviously your preference. The 8.5-inch wide piece of fabric works really well, and if you look, there are a lot of designs that have you use 9-inch pieces of fabric on the designs where you turn it inside out. Well, the 8.5-inch wide, if you use bias tape, it gives you the same dimension of mask because you don't have a seam allowance that you lose when you turn the mask inside out. Now, the other thing that you're going to need is bias tape. And I've been making my own bias tape for the last 6 months or so since I got a handy dandy bias tape maker. So in the next segment, I'll talk to you a little bit about how you make the bias tape and where you can get your own bias tape maker. A key difference in how I make my mask has to do with bias tape. And I have begun making my own bias tape for a couple of reasons. One of them is aesthetics. If you go to the rack of bias tape at your fabric store, you're going to have a limited amount of styles and colors to choose from. However, if you make your own, you can pick any cotton fabric in the store and use it for bias tape. This is a double fold bias tape that I made, 1/2 inch, using this blue fabric. This is a single fold out of the pink. Now, another reason to make your own bias tape is thrift. If you buy commercial bias tape in the store, it'll set you back $2.50 for a 3-yard package of bias tape. However, if you buy a 1/2 yard of fabric, you can make up to 3 times that much. So let's assume that you buy $5 per yard fabric. 1/2 yard of that is $2.50, and it will yield about 10 yards of bias tape for your project. That gives you 3 times the bias tape at much prettier colors than you would in buying a commercial package. Of course, it's more work. To make my bias tape, I have purchased this bias tape maker kit on eBay. I'll link it in the description below. It comes in 4 different sizes of bias tape as well as some other accessories. Now, the one that I'm using for this project is the 24mm size. It will yield a 1-inch wide size of a single fold bias tape, which you can fold in half to make a 1/2 inch size. The other tool that I will often use is this awl that came with the kit. To make the bias tape, you will need to cut 1 7/8 inch strips of fabric and cut a little point at the end as well. When you stick it into the device, you put it wrong sides up into the fat end and poke it through. You may need to use the awl to go ahead and get the fabric through to the skinny end of the device. Now you'll see that it already starts to fold as it comes out of the skinny end. What I do is I hold it down and make sure that I iron it really well so it helps remember that shape. After this is initially ironed, then you grab the little pull tab and pull with one hand and iron with the other through the length of the fabric. Now, one thing about this project is that you don't need to use tape cut on the bias. You can cut this on the straight grain. The reason that people use bias tape is to go around curves. And since none of the lines in this project are curves, you can cut it on the straight grain, which means that you don't need as much fabric as if it were cut on the bias. I am making large amounts of mask, and the yield for 1 yard of fabric is 44 mask. I use 18 inches of bias tape per mask, and you can cut 22 strips of tape out of a 45-inch wide piece of fabric. That means that you have 44 pieces of bias tape to make mask out of for 1 yard of fabric. Let's talk wire. Now, some people are using pipe cleaners for their mask. Some are using twist ties. I am using this 24 gauge, 10-pound galvanized steel wire. This roll is 250 feet. I bought it at Ace Hardware for $7. So this will make about 400 masks. Now, I cut each piece of wire about 7 inches long. And when I say about, I mean approximately. I have this tray that is roughly 7 inches long, and to cut the wire, I just take the end of the wire, stretch it across the tray, use my wire cutters, and clip it and put it into the tray. And this way I can make a whole lot of wire pieces in a very short amount of time. My primary concern in making mask is that I don't want anybody to be poked in the face with the wire. So what I do is I take my needle nose pliers and I make a little curlicue at each end of the wire. I wrap the wire around a couple of times, and then I use the end of the needle nose pliers to smoosh it in place. And as you can see, the end of the wire is wrapped around and encased inside this little loop of wire. Naturally, you gotta do it to both ends. And so when I am done with this, I have a nice piece of wire that's going to be long enough to give a good fit for my wearer and go inside of the bias tape that I'll be using for the mask. Now we begin sewing. We start by taking the two raw edges and matching them at the top, and then lay the bias tape strip above it. Center it on the mask fabric, and you'll have about 5 inches on each end. Then tuck it underneath and create a little tuck that is triangle shaped at the end. You will then sew that to secure it in place. Next, you want to reposition the fabric and make sure it's tucked into the bias tape, and then center the wire on the fabric. You want to know where that wire is going to start, and then you sew right up to that spot and turn the fabric, going back and forth to form a stop. You turn the fabric again, sew 5, 6, 7 stitches, and then tuck the curlicue into that little pocket that you've made. Turning it again, you will sew back and forth very carefully so you don't hit the wire. Go back and forth a couple of times, and then you have your wire secured at that end. Turning it again, you tuck the wire into the fabric and continue sewing down the rest of the mask. You want to make sure that the wire stays on that far right hand side, and you can feel it with your finger as you go along. At the end, you want to identify that second curlicue, hold it with your fingers, and then gradually go into the far right side so that you can form another pocket to hold that second curlicue. Go around at the end, being careful not to catch the metal, and then when you get past the metal, you're going to make another triangle at the other end of the fabric and continue sewing till you get to the end of the fabric. The front stitching is now completed. You turn it to the back side, and at the bottom create a tuck about a ½ inch from the bottom, and you're going to insert your first piece of elastic in here. You back stitch it several times to secure it because you don't want the elastic coming out. Then you create the next tuck, and I use a seam ripper so that I don't get my fingers caught, and it shoves the fabric right up to that other fold, and then create the third crease roughly the same amount, same size. You're going to secure the other end of that elastic at the very end of that last tuck at the top of the mask, and again back stitch a couple of times to make sure that it's good and secure. You repeat the process of tucking the fabric on the other side. This time I usually start at the top and secure it from there. So again, we start, we back stitch a couple of times, and then we create the tucks, the other two tucks. This one tends to be a little bit easier because you already have the fold on the other side, and you just continue that same natural flow of the fabric. Go down the first tuck, the second tuck, the third tuck, and at the very end of the third tuck, you again secure that elastic, back stitching a couple of times to make sure it doesn't come out. When I told you you needed 18 inches of bias tape, I was being generous. You probably only need 16 to 17 inches. So after you get all the pleats in, you want to cut off the excess, leaving about a ½ inch at the ends. In the final step, I switch to a zigzag and turn those edges over to do the final stitching. You run along the back edge of that bias tape, and then at the very bottom, I tuck the raw edges underneath. It's really difficult to see because my hands are in the way, my apologies, but you tuck those raw edges in and sew them and zigzag until you get to the bottom of the mask. Repeat the same steps on the other side. This time I start at the bottom and go back and forth, again tucking those raw edges in. You can see it a little better here, zigzagging all the way through until you get to the top of the mask. And your mask is now complete. Here's the front, and here's the back. Stay safe, everyone. Elastic for mask is a really hot commodity these days, and some people are having difficulty finding supplies for their earpieces. If you're one of those, or perhaps you just want to make a mask with fabric ties instead of elastic, check out part 2 of my video series for instructions on how to make a bias tape mask without elastic.
This has been a Loki production.